You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's discussion, we're going to discuss each presidential candidate and their stands on geopolitical issues. Joining me today is Lori Esposito Murray, the former president of the Committee for Economic Development. She's also a current senior fellow for national security and managing director of CEO programs at the Council on Foreign Relations. Lori, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Very pleased to be here. It's an important year for elections around the world, and needless to say, the world is waiting for the election here.
Well, amen. And, there are elections all over the world. So there are shifting sands here, some of them, less than others. But I know we're going to talk about the U.S. situation, but also how it fits with all the international elections in play. But let's just start by level setting. Some of our listeners will be, complete experts on this. Some may not know all the lingo. But start with, what do we mean when we talk about geopolitical policy as it relates to the federal level?
So you're really talking about international politics. And on the federal level, for the U.S. government, international politics means foreign relations, how the U.S. Interacts with countries, with allies, with coalitions, and also how it responds to non-state actors as well. So it's the political side of international policy.
Yeah, and it intersects with trade policy, with defense policy, with international business, right? It's sort of you have to start with geopolitical policy before the rest of it kind of sorts out, doesn't it?
Yeah, actually, it's the overlay. Our relations with leading powers, with emerging economies, our relations with countries really determines our relations in terms of the global economy, national security, international security. So it really is the overlay.
Yeah, and so, some people say, well, why are we talking about this? Because it doesn't really change. I mean, regardless of government. But there are some differences between the candidates.
And I think it's particularly important when you're dealing with the world's largest economy, the United States, a leading world power since World War II, the main power mostly concerned about rule of law that helped to develop the current international rules of law and interaction. The election of the United States is very important in terms of the direction for U.S. policy, U.S. leadership, and how that will play on the world stage.
Amen to that. Now, everybody knows the Conference Board is completely nonpartisan, and so our conversation is going to attempt to take a dispassionate approach to explore the policy differences here. And I think we should just mention for our listeners that if you think you hear something that Lori says that sounds like she's in favor of one candidate or another, you're not hearing it right. She's not, and so that's an important thing to listen to with your filter. Okay, so let's just walk through each of the geopolitical issues, and then maybe if you could compare and contrast a potential Harris administration versus a potential Trump administration. I think you've got to start probably with the Russia-Ukraine situation, which is dragging on here after many years. What are your thoughts?
Well, looking at Russia-Ukraine is extremely important, but I'd first like to just step back and make a major point here that international politics, geopolitical policy is undergoing major transformations right now. And that's largely driven by the rise of China, its relationship with the US, deglobalization, our move away from globalization, our new and more antagonistic relationship with Russia, and the Russia-China alliance. So those are the major changes, fissures that are happening, geopolitics and geoeconomics. And so to look at the Russia-Ukraine issue, you really have to put it in that context, why it's so important, and why is it affecting, and how is it affecting international politics overall. And so in terms of how the candidates are looking at it, that's the major key approach of the Biden administration, of Vice President Harris's policies. She's really seeing it through the prism of international politics, that Russia illegally invaded Ukraine, and that if we don't stand by Ukraine, it will have important and very serious implications for geopolitics going forward, for other nations to read the wrong signals, particularly China vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so we must support Ukraine. But even there, as in any war where the US and Russia had a stake during the Cold War, since the advent of nuclear weapons, the way the US has approached these wars is to put a limit on what we do so that we don't escalate the war to a world war or to a nuclear war. And so it's within the context of, yes, it's very important for the US to support Ukraine, but we don't want this spilling over to NATO. And if it spills over to NATO in terms of escalation, it, according to Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, one for all and all for one, it becomes a much larger war. So that's the constraint on Vice President Harris's policy. It's really interesting because this is one of the fundamental debates when you look at President Trump's policy that has really perpetrated United States foreign policy since the very beginning of time. And that is, what is the role of the US? How much do we really care about, or should we care about what's happening internationally? How are we weighing that? And should we be paying more attention to what's happening here at home? And that's where, and very discreetly determining which foreign policy issues are really in the US interest and which ones should we not get involved in and pay more attention to what's happening at home. And of course, that's has become defined throughout our history as isolationism, which is a constant strain in US, in America's thinking, and an important constraint on America's role in the world. So the way President Trump is looking at the Ukraine involvement, if you follow his statements, he really basically doesn't think the war should have happened in the first place. He talks about how Ukraine should have negotiated with Putin even prior to the invasion. He has a much more limited view in terms of what is really at stake for the US and Ukraine. How important is it, and whether the issues here at home are much more important than the US providing that much support, money, arms, depleting the US defense industrial base for what's happening in Ukraine.
So the Biden administration, and presumably then a carry-on of a Harris administration, has been funding Ukraine, and not as much as President Zelensky would like, and maybe not as much as our NATO allies would like. President Trump, on the other hand, says he'd settle it within a few days. Maybe talk about reality. What is possible here? Do we just, if you followed a Harris policy, would this thing just drag on, forever? The decade-long Afghan-Soviet situation. And if Trump, wins, he said he settled it within days. Does that just mean a capitulation to Putin?
So that's what's really key here, and where we're going, and where this policy needs to go. I think in terms of Vice President Harris and the policy that we've been following over the past several years since the invasion of Ukraine, the goal is to put Ukraine in a position of strength so it can negotiate and we can get a peaceful settlement. I think President Trump is much more anxious to get a peaceful settlement, which gets people very concerned. And he's indicated that he would consider trading off territory. He has rejected Putin's peace plan, but has raised concern, particularly among the Ukrainians and President Zelensky, about how he would approach it and what he would consider a fair agreement. But they met, and recently in September, after a bit of controversy, and President Trump came out and said he was for a fair deal in Ukraine. So those are the concerns. How much would President Trump be willing to support in terms of giving away Ukrainian territory versus concerns about, can we help Ukraine be in a position where it can actually negotiate a better agreement?
It sounds like the solution for a Trump administration is to deal away the Donbass, which is a non-starter for Ukraine. How do you square that circle?
I think in any case, as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, we're not looking at a short resolution to this issue. No matter what President Trump has promised in terms of how quickly he can bring this about, there, as you said, there's a reality here. And the reality is the Ukrainians, President Zelensky, have red lines in terms of what they can support. They have lost many lives. They have the country has been devastated by the Russian invasion, and their commitment to to Ukraine is very strong. And they're in a position where, in terms of what they give away, as far as what's acceptable to the Ukrainians, is pretty constrained. So I think the bottom line here is that we're looking at this not ending anytime soon, and it being a continuing problem, at least in the first phases of a new administration, if not for the next several years all the way through.
But this raises the question about, the squandering of our own treasury and whether that weakens our defenses, whether it, depletes our, certainly ammunition, but also weapon stocks. And everybody's watching that too. And that brings up Russia's, seemingly new partner in China and their own saber rattling in Taiwan. So that you have to sort of think about these issues together, as you've said before. So what would be the two administrations' differences on the China-Taiwan situation?
Well, that's really interesting as well. And the most important point here with regards to Ukraine is that China and Xi Jinping are watching Ukraine very closely. And they're watching to see how the U.S., how long the U.S. maintains support, where it goes, what are the pivotal turning points in either reaching an agreement or the war escalating. Needless to say, at the beginning of this, neither Putin and I would say Xi really bought into this, thinking that it was going to be a long war. And so President Xi is following this. China's following Ukraine really closely in terms of how it reflects on Chinese policy towards Taiwan and how the rest of the world would react towards Taiwan. So in terms of the two candidates, it's really interesting and a little complex. And of course, it's hard to predict what either one of them would do, especially I would say with President Trump, since he tends to be more reactional as policies unfold. But for Vice President Harris, she's very much following the U.S. foreign policy and our relations with Taiwan, the importance of those relations with Taiwan, but reinforcing that we don't support the independence of Taiwan. But nonetheless, we've seen an increase under the Biden-Harris administration in terms of defense support for Taiwan, military support for Taiwan, as well as political support for Taiwan, congratulating the new president who came in, Lai Chang-te, who is not favored by China, to say the least, but pretty much towing the traditional U.S. policy line on Taiwan. President Trump, on the other hand, is actually a little bit of a more complex in terms of how he has dealt with Taiwan in the past and what he may do in the future. His administration, his closest aides during his first administration, were very forward-leaning on Taiwan. He took a call from the Taiwanese President Tsai prior to his inauguration, who congratulated him, and that very much concerned the Chinese. But then he met with President Xi and really tempered somewhat his language towards Taiwan, recognizing the importance that China plays in U.S. relations. He clearly supports Taiwan, but it also gets caught up in his his attitudes towards our allies overall and questions why they aren't paying for more of our defense support, paying more for their own defense, and how much they're contributing to the defense versus what the U.S. is contributing towards the defense. So it gets caught in that rubric of President Trump's overall view of allies and U.S. security role throughout the world. So interesting. Needless to say, his administration is going to come in with very strong support for Taiwan. But if it escalates, I think both Vice President Harris and President Trump would work very hard to make sure that we did all we could so that it didn't become an actual war in the Taiwan Straits.
Okay, so quick answers then. If there's a Harris administration, does China invade Taiwan?
I think actually China is preparing and wants the perception that it's preparing for a military invasion of Taiwan in order to help control the Taiwanese reactions to China. And, they've openly said that by 2027, they want the military capability to invade Taiwan. So looking at 2027, that makes that an issue in the new administration. I think the invasion of Taiwan, an actual military invasion of Taiwan, is much more complicated for the Chinese than some analysis has actually discussed, or even how the Chinese discuss it or talk about it. Protecting the semiconductor manufacturing plants is really important, and they're also very vulnerable to any disruption. So that would be a key value for the Chinese. And so doing something more politically, which is their twofold approach to Taiwan. You threaten military action, you make sure that the Taiwanese are aware of your military strength, but at the same time also working politically to work with the attitudes of the Taiwanese as far as moving political opinion so that integrating more with China and ultimately integrating with China is not something that the Taiwanese see as adverse, but something that they see in terms of actually being able to be more prosperous, more part of a stronger unified China.
Okay, but do they invade in a Harris administration? I think you said no.
I don't think they really invade in either administration.
Okay,
and I think
all right.
the big
Okay.
lesson is Ukraine.
Okay. So if they don't invade, then there's no need for the U.S. to start thinking about kinetic action in the area, right?
No, Steve, I'd actually push back on that because when you look at U.S. defense posture, policy, signaling, deterrence is as important as whether you actually go to war. What you're trying to do is deter war. And so support for Taiwanese, military support for the Taiwanese, for their defense systems, U.S. capabilities in the region to send the signal to the Chinese that whatever you do will be at a high cost, our relationship with our Asia-Pacific allies to send the same message, our work globally to support Taiwan and Taiwan's current status is all very important. That's all part of deterrence. And so I'd push back on what you just said, because what you are signaling militarily and how you develop your military policy and posture is as critical to avoiding war as being able to fight the war itself.
Right. So if you do that, then what you're saying is China doesn't really want a war. They're trying to change attitudes. The U.S. doesn't want a war, but needs to display their power to avoid a war. So everything looks like all the strategies are to avoid a war. Then the question is whether they would actually do it and what that would mean. Let's turn our attention to the Middle East. I think we've been saying that probably for the past 100 years. But it seems now that everybody talks about Israel versus Iran, but it feels some days like it's Israel against the world. Talk about a potential Harris and Trump administration as it relates to the Middle East.
And here again, I think it's more similarities than differences, but different approaches. So Vice President Harris has been really clear that Israel has a right to defend itself. But she has also called for a ceasefire and has been responsive to the humanitarian crisis that's happening in the Middle East and how important that is, that we should be responding to that. She's in favor of a two-state solution. She's in favor of military aid to Israel. So leaning a little bit forward, more forward than President Biden, leaning earlier, more forward than President Biden was in terms of calling for a ceasefire. But two-state solution, Israel has a right to defend itself. President Trump, obviously, with the Abraham Accords, has really changed the dynamic during his presidency in the Middle East, where he was really working towards, as a top priority, relations with the Arab and Middle East states' relations with Israel as a country, and moving the Middle East more towards more towards diplomatic resolution of Israel as a way to restoring peace. That's a top priority. But that's also been very much supported by the Biden-Harris administration and by Vice President Harris. So it's really key. But again, if you're looking at this war and the war in the Middle East, it is also something that is not going to end quickly, and has as with Ukraine, I think the most important issue for the U.S. and for the world is the potential for it to escalate, and for it to escalate as a regional war and escalate beyond that, as well as in Ukraine. And so working to make sure that the war doesn't escalate, that what the response is, and here we're dealing with the Israeli-Iranian situation, that it doesn't escalate and become a much larger war in Ukraine. You're dealing with NATO getting involved. And so priority number one is to try and keep the escalation control. Priority number two is trying to get the situation resolved peacefully.
Yeah, and this whole thing about a ceasefire is interesting, but they are a sovereign nation. We have some input there because we help to supply and fund their military. But as an ally, an independent ally, the only democratic state in the region, being attacked from all angles, funded by Iran, it doesn't. You can't just say ceasefire and snap your fingers, because it doesn't actually happen that way. And if it did, then you'd have everybody rearming and resetting, and it actually works in favor of the enemy. So how do you deal with that?
In terms of what the U.S. role should be?
Yeah.
With Israel, I think we have to continue to make really clear to Israel what's at stake, where the U.S. stands, the importance of the humanitarian crisis that's underway. Obviously under the rubric that Israel has a right to defend itself, but it is so easy, even if it isn't by design, but by miscalculation, that both of these major conflicts can escalate into a global conflict, and we have to keep that as our front of mind in anything that we do in terms of our relationships, and that involves with President Zelensky and the request for how to use the military aid we're giving them, whether they can use it in terms of long range strikes into Russia, as it is in the Middle East, and with Israel, to be in constant communication and dialogue, not only with Israel, but with our Middle East partners as well, in terms of keeping this from escalating.
Yeah, but you also have to deal with the Russia-China situation, because Russia and China and North Korea have been funding Iran through this, and basically you've got a new triumvirate. Whether you call it an axis of evil or something else, they certainly are military allies here. So this is just bigger than it has been before, which underscores your point that this could spill over into something much, much larger if mishandled.
And I think when the stakes become very high for both China and Russia in the Middle East, you'll see actually a move towards more engagement among China, Russia, the great powers, so to speak, as they're called, important powers, to actually try to de-escalate the situation as well.
Yeah.
Most of China's oil comes from Iran. It doesn't, or I would say 90% of Iran's oil goes to China. Not most of China's oil comes from Iran, but 90% of Iran's oil goes to China. It's a very important part of the energy source for China. If that gets threatened, and China's interests actually are at risk, more so than they have been in the past, I think you'll see China getting much more involved in trying to bring this to a at least a stable and more peaceful resolution.
We talked about some of the adversarial issues geopolitically, but let's go to our friends, NATO. And there's rhetoric out there. I think the press has said that another President Trump administration would not support NATO. We would pull out or run away. That's not exactly what he said, but just talk about a potential Harris and Trump administration as it relates to our relationship with NATO and engagement.
Well, the Biden-Harris administration has prioritized NATO's as in terms of our allies, our relationship, strengthening it, building it, expanding it. And they've been very, very successful at that. NATO is, I would say, the NATO allies are somewhat concerned, at least reportedly, about a Trump administration. President Trump has prioritized, as he has, across our allies across the world, but most intensely focused on NATO in terms of how much they actually contribute to their own defense. In fact, that has changed markedly since his presidency, where the majority of NATO countries are spending more than 2%, it's not a treaty goal. It was a goal that was developed at one of the NATO summits with President Obama. But they're contributing markedly to the support for Ukraine. It is a priority interest for them. The concern is that President Trump will be much more disruptive in terms of the alliance. His statement about Putin can do whatever he wants if NATO doesn't pay for itself is something that really rattles the NATO countries, and keeping a cohesion, particularly with the war in Ukraine, is extremely important. So there is concern among the allies, as far as each of these candidates, at least reportedly so, in terms of the strength of the alliance and where it goes.
Now, there's some key issues coming up in the next administration, and some of it's carryover, some of it's just on schedule. One of them is the USMCA renegotiation, which is coming up, in 2026? And how would you see Harris approach that versus Trump?
Well, Vice President Harris's position on the USMCA is interesting, and also, I think, a little bit more interesting than recognized. She actually voted against the USMCA when it came up in the Senate, and she voted against it, which gives insights into how she might approach the review that's coming up in the next year. That she voted against it because she thought the labor requirements in terms of protecting labor should be stronger, and she was also very much concerned about it not addressing climate as much as it should. And I think those will be two principal issues that she takes into the review, or would take into the review. But what's absolutely fundamental here is that the USMCA is the foundation of a $1.5 trillion trade among the three countries. It is extremely important for North America. It's extremely important to the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And I think any president will have that as the foundational piece of the review of the USMCA. I think President Trump, it's his agreement, and it's his agreement that got bipartisan support. Really unusual for a trade agreement. So you have to recognize that he's coming in, and he has said that he renegotiated the worst agreement ever which was NAFTA. And so he's coming in, looking at an agreement that he renegotiated. He has made it clear that he thinks any treaty could even be better. I think what he will be looking at, and of course, I think this will be part of what Vice President Harris will be looking at, is what is the major difference that's happening, the major transformation that's happening with Mexico, mostly with Mexico, but also with China, with Canada, is that China, as part of the deglobalization, which is as much a result of COVID and countries' concerns about totally being dependent on one country for a major source, China for pharmaceuticals, just the whole supply chain issues, critical minerals, just go down the list, manufacturing overall. This move towards onshoring, reshoring, and the focus of China on investing in Mexico. And so that's a real problem in terms of transshipments and China's investment in Mexico. Is this a backdoor that China will be using to avoid the regulations and restrictions on Chinese technology that we have placed on them and may place more? Is it a backdoor to come into the U.S. markets and to compete with the U.S. through Mexico? So that's going to be a key issue for Trump. I think immigration is going to be a key issue for Trump. It was in the first round when he was renegotiating USMCA, how to get Mexico to be more responsive to the immigration issues. But I think, as I said, in any case, coming into the review of the USMCA, the President of the United States, as well as the leaders of Mexico and Canada, are recognizing the economic significance and the foundational significance of the USMCA in terms of trade among the countries.
Yeah, and there are three parties in this treaty, so each one of them has the opportunity to try to negotiate something different or quote unquote better for them. So this is a bit of a moving thing, but it's essentially working. It's very important. These are our neighbors. Trade, is the key to peace and prosperity in the region. So this has to be renegotiated peacefully. Not that it wouldn't, but peacefully and positively in either administration. So now you mentioned, okay, the immigration. Let's just talk about the southern border, because that is a friction point here with Mexico, particularly under a Trump administration. Talk about what a Harris approach would be to the southern border and what a Trump approach would be.
Here, first of all, they both recognize, and it is just objectively true, that what is happening on the southern border is a real crisis for the United States. It has to be resolved. It needs bipartisan support, and it needs a comprehensive approach. And so, Vice President Harris is in favor of comprehensive immigration reform, and that's the foundational piece of her policy. Obviously, comprehensive immigration reform has been very difficult. We almost got there under President George W. Bush, but we're unable to then, and still unable to now. But that's the piece of her. That's the foundation of her approach. She supported the bipartisan border security bill, which finally, after years and months of negotiating, the Republicans and Democrats came to an agreement on the immigration, a bipartisan immigration. That was a pretty tough bill, and it was a little bit too close to the election, and President Trump asked Republicans not to support it. And of course, this is a big issue in the campaign, as everyone knows. And I think that may actually form the basis for both administrations in terms of if we're looking to move forward constructively on the border, that may actually be the foundational piece to work off of in a constructive way. But in any case, there are major differences between the candidates on immigration and how to approach it, and it really is looking at the asylum and border deportation issues. The Biden administration has actually tried to reform the asylum in terms of allowing minors to have temporary status before traveling, more support for U.S. refugee resettlement, and President Trump is on the total opposite end of the spectrum on asylum and deportations, and very much on the opposite. They're very much on opposite ends. But as I said, I think it's the bipartisan bill that could serve the basis for moving forward. And President Trump does have a history of saying that something is the worst, and then he works off of it, like NAFTA. He built off of it. And so
the great negotiator, and that's how he comes at everything. And so, sometimes he puts a stake in the ground that looks like, really radical, but it's trying to get the other party to move. It's a tactic.
But what he will actually do remains to be seen. What he's saying he's doing is really going back to the very tough
Right.
Restrictions that he had at the beginning of his first term.
Okay, so of all the issues we've talked about, there's a lot, but the question is whether the president can do some of this stuff unilaterally, or whether the president has to have Congress. And the most likely scenario is that the House will have split representation. The Ds will control one, the Rs will control the other. So you probably don't have one party controlling Congress and the White House, which makes it interesting for some of these. Talk about how a Harris and a Trump administration would actually implement some of these issues.
Well, on China, first of all, in terms of foreign policy, the president has actually more authority than on domestic policy and budgets. And one of the areas where the president has almost free reign is on tariffs, believe it or not. And I think that's why you see tariffs playing such an important role in our policy towards China, as a tool in our policy towards China. The international organizations, the WTO, negotiations on trade agreements and trade disputes, even with China, have not been productive, or have collapsed. And so using tariffs has become a tool that both administrations, Democratic and Republican, are relying on. And it's also an area where there's bipartisan support in Congress. So I think you're going to see a movement on tariffs overall. And, obviously in terms of treaties, you have to get a treaty through the Senate. But in terms of executive action and freedom of movement, as well as diplomacy, the president actually has a lot of discretion under the Constitution.
Immigration
has to go through Congress. So as you take each of these issues, trade agreements, immigration, support for Israel, support for Ukraine, military support for Ukraine, economic support, that all goes through Congress. How do you do that? I think that obviously on China, there's bipartisan agreement on China. And matter of fact, in some cases, a divided Congress has been pushing the administration in directions. And so I think the China policy will be easier to implement because of the bipartisan support and agreement on our policies, our approach to China. In terms of Ukraine, I think it's going to be much more difficult, but it will depend on how the numbers come out in the Senate and the House, and getting that support for Ukraine. So Ukraine will need congressional support. In the Middle East, again, if the focus is on diplomacy and ending the war through coalition building and working with our allies and partners in the Middle East, obviously that's more in the hands of the president. In terms of Israeli aid, that again depends. I think Israeli aid is something that there is large support for. And how it is tweaked, it depends on how the numbers come out in the House and the Senate.
Okay, finally, if you were the president of China or the president of Russia, and a lot has been written on it. Nobody knows, but what would they think about each of these two candidates? Which would they prefer to deal with?
I think on China, that President Xi Jinping is looking at this as he has a problem either way because the policy is bipartisan towards China. And I think he reads that pretty clearly. So I think on China, it's a split. On Russia, Putin obviously has a better relationship with Trump than he's had with President Biden and or with Vice President Harris. And so if he's weighing whose ear he has, I think he would be leaning towards a Trump administration.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to make a main point, though, about the direction of U.S. foreign policy in reaction to what's happening geopolitically. And there are some really consistent themes here that are historic in terms of our trajectory. And so key here is that the U.S. is moving in a much more protectionist direction. We're using tariffs more because the international organizations, as I mentioned, have collapsed. We're using unilateral tools. We've moved away from trade agreements where there's a agreement among both the Trump administration and the Biden administration not to support candidates for WTO because we don't see it as a fair environment for U.S. concerns. So I think we're moving in a trajectory of more protectionism, more industrial policy. And as I said, that's a result of COVID shocking us and the world about supply chains, as well as concerns about our competition with China. So it's been fueled by that and consequently more isolationism, where isolation is becoming more predominant in the American public. And so among the American public. And so I think these are historical trends that are taking us into the next administration that in terms of perceptions about the U.S. And I was just moderating a discussion with four major CEOs, four global CEOs from various regions of the world, Asia Pacific, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. And it was the one point that they all agreed on, that the U.S. overall, even though the Biden administration has been perceived here as being everywhere, doing everything all at once with the wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine, that the U.S. overall has been in retreat, and that China's presence has, in parallel, increased in these areas around the world in terms of their involvement in helping the emerging economies. And so I think that's a major trend that is overlaying the type of perceptions around the world that the new president will be dealing with that are really critical.
Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Steve. Really appreciate it.
And thanks to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.